First of all, to President Gene Wilkes and to members of the faculty, and of course to Dr. Karen Bullock, whom many of us have had contact with, and to the foundation that makes these lectures and this colloquy possible, my sincere thanks. I'm deeply honored to be, so to speak, at the table and in conversation with you. And indeed trust that in times that are without, it's not melodramatic to say the following, that we are in perplexing times, and we could state that on multiple fronts. My prayer is that you would find what I have to say this afternoon and tomorrow morning and afternoon, that you'll find what I have to say not only helpful, but also may God grant us this grace, that you would also find it encouraging. That is, that you will experience on some degree the renewal of hope, which of course we need, a resilient hope for these times and in these places that God has called us to serve him. I grew up in Ecuador in South America. My parents were evangelical Christian missionaries inspired by the 5 martyrs that some of you may be familiar with to go to Ecuador. That's where I grew up, always with this assumption that my parents, in a sense, drilled into us as children as we came back and forth between North America and Ecuador. And even within Ecuador, my parents worked amongst the mountain people, the coastal people, and out for a season amongst the people of the Amazon jungle. And there was always this assumption that the gospel, in terms of how it found expression, it would not be the same amongst these people as per our people back in what we talked about then, the homeland. The assumption was always that the gospel would be located, it would be housed, or to use more contemporary language, it would be enculturated. That is, it would be in this time and in this place. And the question I want to ask is, do we need to do the same kind of work in our time? Do we need to do we took for granted, in a sense, at that time, that the gospel was enculturated within North American society. We kind of took it for granted that was done. Now we're going to do it in other contexts. But what people like Leslie Newbegin have showed us is that we need to do some homework, that the times they are changing, that North American society and culture has changed in some pretty fundamental ways. And the consequence is that maybe we need to do the same kind of due diligence. We need to do the same kind of homework. When I was an MDiv student back in the 1970s, the seminary that I went to, and it's actually this seminary, the seminary has since moved to Calgary, you could kind of choose 1 or 2 tracks for your Master of Divinity. You could do a degree in pastoral theology and an MDiv with a focus in pastoral theology, or you could do an MDiv with a focus in intercultural ministries. And because my wife and I anticipated that we were going to go internationally, as it happened with the Christian and Missionary Alliance, and indeed I spent a decade in the Philippines, well, then we took the intercultural ministry track. But my colleagues and friends who anticipated being pastors, they took the pastoral ministry track. And those of us, like myself, that were in the intercultural ministry track, well, we studied such things as world religions. We studied such things as intercultural ministry. We studied such things as, how does the gospel get enculturated in this time and in this place? And we took for granted on the pastoral theology front that you didn't need to do that kind of research and homework and due diligence. Well, there's no excuse now. Back then in the 1970s, actually, I think it was pretty naive then, but now there is no excuse. Students who are doing theological education now need to think in terms of this time and this place, and what does it mean for the gospel to be housed in this particular social, cultural context. As I mentioned, I grew up in Ecuador in South America. We would, every 5 years, as was the practice then, we would come back to Canada on what was then called furlough. Now they call it home assignment, but my father liked the word furlough because then he could say I could spend a year doing furloughing, as he called it. So it was part of his humor. And we came back to where my mother grew up in Belleville, Ontario. And during that 1 year back on Canadian soil, we would worship at what was then called the Alliance Tabernacle. I still flinch that it was called the Alliance Tabernacle. It is without doubt a suspect ecclesiology to call your buildings tabernacles, but be that as it may, we worshiped for that year at the Alliance Tabernacle. Since then, now that was many years ago, back in the 1960s, since then that building has been sold and that congregation has moved to the outskirts, to the suburbs of Belleville, Ontario, when that building was sold, it was sold to Saudi money. And that building is now a Muslim mosque. A decade or so later, when I was an undergraduate student, and then when I was a seminary student, I think we had some idea where there was a mosque in Canada. We knew there was one, but if you had asked me in the 1970s, do you know where there's a mosque? I would not have known where there was a mosque, though I would have assumed, I guess there might be one here. But if you want to know where Muslims are, people of Islamic faith, where they're on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, they're not here in our context, in our setting. Well, you know where I'm going with this, because every student at Ambrose University and Seminary knows where there's a mosque is. It's unavoidable, because if you take the light rail transit from downtown Calgary to our campus, the last building you see before you go underground to our stop is a mosque. Every student, every seminary student, every university undergraduate knows where there's a mosque. It's part of the new reality of what it means to be Canada. That is, this is not some strange aberration. We live now in a country that is marked by religious pluralism. Vancouver and Toronto are perhaps two of the most multicultural, multi-ethnic cities in the world. There's a street, actually, it's called Number 5 Road in Richmond, BC, just south of Vancouver. If you drive down Number 5 Road, you pass by a Sikh temple, a Buddhist temple, a Hindu temple, a Muslim mosque, a Jewish study and learning center, and a number of churches. The folks in that area call it Religion Row. And I often make the comment to our churches across this country that Number 5 Road is the future of Canada. It's not just this aberration on the outskirts of Richmond, south of Vancouver, strange people on the West Coast. This is the future of Canada. And it's interesting to say those words from the pulpit on a typical Sunday morning to a typical congregation and see how they respond. Does it lift an eyebrow and say, yes, this is good. This is something we want to see happen. Or does it furrow the brow? That is, do they think, that's a problem? Well, you probably know where I'm going, because I actually tend to think that this is an intriguing, good thing and perhaps providential. But there's another direction that I want to go. Religious pluralism is part of the landscape, without doubt, here in North America. But there's another dynamic at play that is actually the dynamic that I bump up against every day in my day job, in my work as a university and seminary president. But I find that my colleagues and friends who are pastors of congregations come up against it again and again and again. And that is what we might call the hegemony of secularism against the backdrop of secularity. I'm making a distinction between the two, secularity and secularism. Later this afternoon, I will be on a roundtable conversation with the Minister of Advanced Education, and what will be implied, if not explicit, in that phone call, that is, in that roundtable with other presidents of universities in this province, what will be implied, if not explicit, is that the religious faith that I bring to the table and the religious identity of the university that I lead is a problem. It's a furrowed brow. It's not welcomed at the table. That in actual fact, even though the social cultural context in which I live and work, even though that social cultural context is ideally one that is marked by religious pluralism, in actual fact, we bump up against the hegemony of secularity and secularism again and again and again. It's taken for granted that the religious voice, that the religious presence is best perhaps seen but not heard. It has no longer a voice in the civic square. We live increasingly in what Charles Taylor has described a secular age. And well, yes, of course, it's perhaps more evident in some parts of the continent than others. Right now, even this very week, in the legislature of Quebec, there's a debate going on about whether or not it's appropriate for you to have any kind of religious symbol when you are a public servant in that province. And that makes us flinch, those of us that are farther away, perhaps, from Quebec. So yes, within Canada, perhaps, there is a greater level of secularity in some parts than others. Perhaps there's greater levels of secularity between Oregon and Alabama. I have no doubt about that. I know also that there's greater levels of secularity in urban contexts in our continent than there are in rural contexts. But here's the assumption that I bring to the table with you this afternoon, that we live in what is increasingly a secular age. We live now in a time and place in which we could say, this is the default mode, this is the way of being, these are the deep sensibilities that shape, form, and inform the culture of which we are a part. That if the gospel is going to be housed in this time and in this place, this is the place, this is the context, this is the social context in which it will be housed in this time and in this place. And therefore, all of us need to be students of secularity. This is our culture. This is where we are. We need to be students of secularity. We need to understand its character, its nuance, its trajectory, in order to be able to ask the question then, how will the church respond? I'll come to that, but just let me say this. What I have found helpful, I'm not a historian, I'm not a sociologist, and I'm not a philosopher, but I have found it helpful to read historians. For example, Mark Noll, who's an astute observer of the contrast between the United States and Canada on this very point. To read sociologists such as David Martin, Joel Thiessen on our faculty here has been a good colleague for me in this regard. Andre Dobelmeyer, a Belgian sociologist, again, an astute observer of the changing character of religion and religious expression within Western Europe and North America. And then I've already alluded to Charles Taylor, but to read philosophers, including the one that many of us have found helpful as a guide to interpreting what Charles Taylor is saying, Jamie K.A. Smith at Calvin College, Calvin University now. And I also lean often into the wisdom and insight of Louis Dupré, professor emeritus at Yale University. Both Charles Taylor and Louis Dupré are philosophers, both of them devout Catholics, and their insight into secularity is profoundly helpful for those of us that are trying to navigate this world in which we feel, to use the astute observation made by David Keegan, in over our heads. And we're going to be asking the question, I'm going to ask the question in a moment, well, where do we find wisdom to navigate this? Where do we find ways and ways by which we can ask the question, what does it mean for the church to be located, for the church to be housed, for the church to be enculturated in this time and in this place? Before I go there, let me though make the observation that I think we need to have a conversation about how we are responding. How are we responding to the phenomena of secularity? What is it that's happening to us emotionally and intellectually in response to the emerging presence of secularity in our culture and in our society? What I have found helpful is to identify four, maybe there are more, I don't presume for a moment there are just four, but I have found it helpful to identify four distinct responses to secularity on this continent, at least, in your country and in mine. That is, the ways in which churches, church communities, faith communities, and for what it's worth, it finds expression within institutions like the B.H. Carroll Theological Institute and Ambrose University, when we ask, how do we do higher education in this time and in this place? The four responses that I see are not new. They're all, you might say, ancient responses, but they help us, in a sense, navigate and shape the conversation that between the two of us, we can say, so if we do this, where does it fit in terms of the ways in which we might choose to respond? There are those, for example, who choose to, you might say, go along to get along. When I was growing up, we called these people Sunday Christians. So that is, that their faith on Sunday morning was essentially, it was located, it was bracketed around Sunday morning. The rest of the week, you would not know that they were in any way, shape, or form different from the society and culture of which they were a part. They did not think of the gospel as somehow in any way, shape, or form is anti or cross-cultural or counter-cultural. They worshiped as Christians on Sunday morning, but for the rest of the week, they were, now to use this language, they were fundamentally secular. That is, there are those who choose to go along to get along, to just say, hey, that's the culture in which we live now. And they have essentially privatized their faith. Their faith is kept to their home. It's kept to their church. They've privatized it. And for what it's worth, as a side note, in a secular culture, that's exactly what they would like you to do. That is, they would like you to privatize your faith as long as you privatize your faith, what you believe. What are the principles that you hold to be true? What is the ethic that you choose to live by? Well, that's your business, but don't bring it into the public square. And for many Christians, they're comfortable to do that. Another response you might call the monastic response. And indeed, it's gotten some airtime of late with a publication known as the Benedictine option. And indeed, for centuries, I should say, the church has chosen to respond to its culture whenever there was alarm, whenever there was a furrowed brow, whenever there was a sense in which the culture was going to cede in some form or another, it was going wrong, it was going rotten. There was indeed this propensity to say, well, then the only hope in the face of this, the demise of society or of civilization, the only hope is to withdraw. And thus the Benedictine option alludes to the monastic response of the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries, in which, despairing for what was happening in Rome and elsewhere, the assumption was the only way you could live a faithful Christian life was to withdraw from the society, to withdraw from the city. And indeed, the Benedictine option assumed withdrawal from the city. You couldn't even be in the city. Later monastic movements, the Franciscans, the Augustinians, the Dominicans, chose to place their monasteries in the city. But even then, there was the assumption at the end of the day, you might go out into the city through the day, but at the end of the day, you retreat into your enclave. And it's interesting to see parallel expressions in our own day of this kind of inclination, this proclivity to withdraw from society as the way to respond to the phenomena of secularity. Here in Alberta, there are a number of institutions of higher education. And indeed, there's one that makes quite the point of saying that you come apart. If you want your child, your daughter, or your son to have a Christian education, well, then you need to do that at, and I won't name the institution, I don't need to, but you come apart. And they're in a very small village in the southern part of the province, and they retreat, you might say. That's where you're going to go, and you're part of an enclave, you live there, and you are formed in your Christian faith there. And I often make the point that Ambrose University, as I just mentioned, is actually at the other end of the light rail transit from Calgary City Hall, from the public library, from the Arts Commons, from the financial district. In actual fact, we're very much in the city, so that, at least for this institution, we've not chosen the monastic response, but that is one response that is gaining currency in our day. That is to assume civilization is going to hell. There's no hope for it. The only hope we have is kind of the monastic response. That's how the Irish saved civilization. We're going to do it the same way. We're going to withdraw. A third response, and one that feels very prominent in the news these days, is what you might speak of as the culture wars response. This response takes as an assumption that North American society, Canadian, US, all the way from Quebec to California, that at one point, at least, it was Christian. At the very least, it privileged the Christian voice. You could have a Christian chaplain, for example, in the Senate. You wouldn't have any other voice in the Senate. But it was just assumed that the Christian voice would be the privileged voice within the society. And there's no doubt, when I was a pastor in the late 70s and 80s, we took for granted that as the pastor of an evangelical congregation in the city where I was serving, that we would have an in, you might say, with the mayor of that small city. We would have voice there. We would have connection there. That it would be expected that we would preside over certain things, that we would bring certain prayers to the public events, because the Christian voice was privileged. But that has all changed. And for what it's worth, it has not just changed in the last decade or even in the last generation. When Bob Dylan penned those immortal words, "The times they are a-changing," that was published in 1964. This has been going on for a while. And indeed, if you read Dostoevsky, or if you read Soren Kierkegaard, 19th century voices would suggest that secularity actually had its seeds, was growing then. And those were two voices that were responding to secularity in the 19th century. This is not some new phenomena, but more to the point, the culture wars response is the response in which the assumption is going to be, this used to be a Christian nation or a Christian state or a Christian province. And the rise of secularity is something we're going to push back against. That is, we're not going to let this happen. We're going to fight it. That is, rather than accepting it, the first option, rather than withdrawing from society that has become secular, we're going to fight, to quote a hymn that gets sung, or song that gets sung every year in the Ambrose University Chapel. I always chuckle a little bit because there's enough people in the room that know that I'm not sure we should be singing it, but you just go along with it. But it's got a line, we're going to win our nation back. And you can just feel all the energy in the room as all this verve and everybody's singing heartily, and we're going to win our nation back. And whenever I hear them sing this, I think, so young people, where did you think it was that you're going to win it back? Well, the train has left the station. We live now in a fundamentally secular society. And the fight to keep it from being secular, typically a fight that goes on three fronts: education, the legislature, and the courts. And that's no different in the US as in Canada. Those are the three battlegrounds. The attempt to resist the emergence of secularity and assume that secularity is a bad thing. I'll go one step further and assume that secularity has allowed for the growth of Islam in our countries, and therefore the two often get lumped together. We're going to fight against both secularity and against the rise of Islam that secularity has made possible. And then a fourth response. James Davidson Hunter, you'd be familiar with. David Fitch, a pastor within my own tradition, just north of Chicago, has published a book, published a book entitled Faithful Presence. And the idea of this response is to say, we're going to take the long arc, we're going to take the long view, and that in actual fact, if we have leverage points within the key institutions within our society, we can actually Christianize our society by leveraging those key points, those key pivot points that give us voice, that give us influence, political and otherwise. That is, we're going to take the long view and find ways in which indeed deep transformation and renovation can happen. I think the reference to faithful presence is an important one, because indeed one of the caveats on all of these four is the following. One, there may actually be some truth in each of these four. There may be something in the first. Maybe indeed, in response to the first view, maybe at some point we just accept that the Lord's Prayer is no longer said at the beginning of city council meetings here in the city of Calgary. And for what it's worth, when I came to Calgary 9 years ago, I chuckled when I heard that we still said the Lord's Prayer at the beginning of city council meetings, because our mayor happens to be Muslim. So I thought, well, he's just being a generous soul, I guess, to let that happen. But it was a sense of carryover, an artifact of a previous time. Our city council meetings are fundamentally secular. Should we just go along to get along? Or secondly, when we talk about the monastic response, is there a way and form and shape in which indeed, if we're not careful, we will be overwhelmed by the culture of which we're part if we don't know what it means to retreat? And thirdly, maybe there is something that is worth fighting for. Maybe there is something that we can say, this is the hill we're going to die on. These are the things we're going to advocate for in the courts, in the schools, and of course, in the legislatures. That is, maybe there's something there as well. And finally, yes, of course, maybe there's something also in what it means to be present, not withdrawing, but to be present within our culture and in our society. I think there's actually truth to all four, and I actually think there's a limitation to all four. But before I come back to that, let me just step back for a moment and say, wow, this is complicated. We are, to use David Keegan's language, we are in over our heads. This is complex. Regularly, I feel I need wisdom and courage for such a time as this. How do I navigate these waters? How do I interface with the Minister of Advanced Education within this province? How do we equip young people in a Christian university to thrive within what is essentially a secular culture? How do we equip these emerging school teachers who are going to teach in the public schools of this province, of this country, of this continent, when potentially they are the only Christian in that public school? How do we give them the skills, yikes, to be able to do this with any kind of integrity, to indeed be a Christian presence, to be Christ's presence, the presence of the Spirit of the living God in that time and in that place? How do we navigate these waters? Well, for me, at least, what I have found helpful is that there is wisdom available to us in order to help us navigate these waters. That is, there's wisdom out there. There's places we can turn. There's indeed ways in which we can say, oh, this in many respects is not a new set of circumstances for the church. And the church has many times faced the following phenomena. That is, that we would name that as the Christian community, we are now a minority presence in this continent. We are now a minority presence in this continent. And what I want to say is, for that, in describing it that way, then what it means is we can learn, we can lean into, we can look to where else has the church been a minority presence and in actual fact thrived as a minority presence, rather than despairing or throwing up their hands or running from it, actually thrived as a minority presence. And I can name at least four that for me at least have been a huge source of both wisdom and encouragement. As many of you know, many have made the observation that it's terrifically helpful to look to the Old Testament prophets, more specifically, the exilic and post-exilic prophets. That the exilic and post-exilic prophets, essentially, they are writing to the people of Judah. They are writing to the people of Judah who are now a minority presence in Babylon or in Persia after the Babylonian captivity. That is, could it be that these voices, the voices of the Old Testament exilic and post-exilic prophets, are more relevant than ever? When I was a seminary student, as I said back in the 70s, of course, because as an evangelical seminary, the biblical text, the canon of Scripture, was an important reference point in our studies. And so, of course, we studied Scripture, but the curriculum, you can't study every book equally. And so it was more or less taken for granted that you would privilege certain books of the Bible because they are viewed somehow as more particular, more pertinent to this time and to this place. And so, perhaps typical of seminaries of that day, I took a course on the introduction to the Old Testament. I took a course on the Psalms, and I took a course on the Proverbs, all immensely valuable. The course on the Proverbs with Bruce Colloquy was transformative. I remember it even then from back in my 20s. In the New Testament, I took a course on the Gospels, of course. I took a course on the book of Revelation, but I found it very weird. But where did we find so much of our energy? We read Paul left, right, and center. I took a whole course on Romans, a whole course on Galatians, a whole course on the Corinthian correspondence. There was no doubt we privileged Paul. But I wonder, not to take away from Paul, I wonder if in our time and in our place, we do not need to privilege the Old Testament exilic and post-exilic prophets. Perhaps Walter Brueggemann is right. We need to be reading Jeremiah like never before. We need to be reading the book of Lamentations and understanding lament against the backdrop of which we're going to speak hope. That is, could it be that the words of the Old Testament prophets, exilic and post-exilic, are remarkably current and relevant to us now, and that the consequence of this is we're not just studying them as seminary students, but we're also preaching them. That if we're going to equip God's people Monday to Friday to be in but not of the world, that what we're going to be doing is preaching these exilic prophets because there's wisdom there. There's wisdom there that can equip us for this time and for this place. Secondly, another source of wisdom that many of us have found to be invaluable is the witness of the early church. A couple of years ago, we had Sarah Colloquy here on our campus giving a lecture on Gregory of Nyssa's reading of John of the Cross and that reading of the Gospel of John. Wow, from Nyssa to John of the Cross to the Gospel of John. And I thought, wow, we found wisdom in the ancient church for today. That could it be that indeed one of the most helpful ways to navigate these waters is to draw on the wisdom of those who, to use language that you're all familiar with, could it be that in a post-Christendom era, We draw on wisdom on what it means to thrive now from the wisdom that comes from the pre-Christendom era. And we can't study all of these voices, but tomorrow afternoon, I'm going to make reference to Tertullian and his call to patience. It's a stinging rebuke, actually, to his generation and to ours. But I have found it immensely helpful to read the namesake of this institution, Ambrose of Milan, how he navigated the unique challenges of being a minority presence with essentially a pagan emperor in the city of Milan, how Augustine navigated and guided and taught and reflected on the faith against his backdrop, and indeed his own experience of conversion from being essentially a pagan to being a Neoplatonist and then becoming a Christian, that indeed could it be that that kind of a sequence is not unique to then, but it's now typical of our day as well? Could it be that indeed their witness, their experience can shape, form, and inform our experience as well? And what Jamie Smith has done, like few others of our day, has shown how the wisdom of Augustine and his understanding of the two cities, how indeed Augustine's two cities, the city of God and the city of man, that we are all dual citizens and what it means to navigate that dual citizenship. But all with this assumption, I say, that our ultimate allegiance is unequivocally not to Caesar, but to the Lord of glory. And in navigating this, there's always going to be a tension between our civic duty, but our ultimate affiliation and duty, and that is our responsibility to the creator and ruler of the universe. Much more could be said. I'm just saying there's wisdom there. And what is interesting to me is that, again, when I was a seminary student, we took church history, of course. And we privileged. You couldn't treat every century equally. So you privileged certain centuries. And you probably know where I'm going. It's a typical evangelical seminary. We started with the Apostle, the New Testament. And I think we kind of just traipsed over the early church. And we went very quickly through the Middle Ages, which of course, in our estimation, were the Dark Ages. And we went all the way to the great light of the 16th century, when finally light was found. And then from there, we skipped all the way to the late 18th century and the evangelical renewal movements, and then to us. So history was from Paul to the Reformers to Wesley, Jonathan Edwards to us. Everything in between, well, maybe not all that significant. I laugh at it now, in part because it's not because I'm discounting the significance of the Reformation, although I still am perplexed that some of the debates from the 16th century are still being fought today. For me, part of the genius of Bonhoeffer is precisely that it did not frame his theological formulations against the backdrop of those debates. I don't question the significance of the evangelical renewal movements of the late 18th century. And if we're going to sing a hymn, we're going to sing a Charles Wesley hymn. So no, terrific. But I wonder, indeed, if in our theological formulations today, we do not need to privilege the voices of the early church. That one of the gaps, you might say, in my theological formation was insufficient attention to these voices that are now, I'm coming to see, towering, giant voices, profoundly relevant to how we navigate what it means to be in minority presence now in a pre-Christendom church, giving wisdom to a post-Christendom church. A third source of wisdom that I find a source of deep encouragement is the historic minority churches. I think, for example, of the church in Japan, India, Pakistan, and in my experience, most notably in Lebanon, although I could just as easily go to Palestine or just as easily also go to Egypt. But I have been privileged in part of my day job in my previous role before I came to this university to be in and out of Lebanon and in conversations with the faculty, the leadership and the faculty of Arab Baptist Theological Seminary in Mansoureh on the outskirts of Beirut. And to realize that for them, this is just the way that it is. That is, the Christian church either flourishes or does not in this context, and it flourishes by learning what it means to be a minority presence. We've always been. For centuries, we've been a minority presence. So the fact that we're a minority presence now is not something we're trying to get used to. It is something that is our way of being. And I have found it wonderfully fruitful to be in conversation with them, and indeed to commend to you, who are those voices that you read that actually represent communities, either in the global south or elsewhere, voices that are the voices of those who speak from what it means to be a minority presence, who are doing theology as a minority presence, who are doing theology where the church likely is being persecuted: China, India, Lebanon, Turkey, Egypt, and to give wisdom to how does it mean to be the church when you've got to be politically astute for not just the survival, but for the thriving of the church. And then finally, for me, another source of wisdom is the wisdom of, and this next point makes an assumption that you might not all share. The assumption that I'm making on this next point is this: that there is a trajectory to secularity, that indeed that when we talk about the times they are changing, and when we talk about the significance of Bob Dylan's song in 1964, that the significance of that song had much greater impact in France, the Scandinavian countries, Germany, the United Kingdom, and on this continent, Quebec. That was really the decade, the 1960s, in which secularity had been growing, but the huge shift happened in the 1960s. And both historians and sociologists make that observation amongst these certain bellwether nations or peoples or contexts. And that indeed it's just getting to Western Canada now, you might say. But I say that more tongue in cheek to say this: could it be that there's a trajectory of secularity, that our societies are becoming more and more secular, and that when we look to Europe, they've actually been secular much longer than we have? That when you look to a country like the Czech Republic, where less than 1% of the population is in any kind of religious service or event on the weekend, Friday or Monday, when you realize that Finland, the Czech Republic, Denmark are the most perhaps secular countries in the world, where there's very little religious expression, if at all. And if indeed you look at the numbers in France and Germany, in the United Kingdom, and the rest of the Scandinavian countries, you see indeed a huge shift much earlier than here in North America. Could it be that in actual fact, Canada is more secular than the United States, and Western and Central Europe is more secular than Canada, but we're on a trajectory? Now, if that assumption is an accurate one, and I know it's being debated, if that's true, then another source of wisdom is to look to the voices of Central and Western Europe and ask them, so how are you navigating this? How are you managing to sustain an authentic and vibrant Christian faith in the face of secularity? And here I lean into contemporary voices like the one I just mentioned, Sarah Colloquy. I think indeed Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, is a remarkably astute observer of what it means to speak about the difference between secularity as a program and secularity as a process. I think of the astute observations of Thomas Halik, a Catholic priest in the Czech Republic, on what does it mean to sustain faith and interiority, an interior vibrant faith in a country that has no religious expression at all. It's so marginal to the public life. That is, could it be that these voices are particularly relevant to us because this is now their world? It's not a new reality for them. In my own reading, going way back to my seminary days with Leslie Newbegin, but then after that, to begin to read Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Jacques Ellul. They represent three different countries. Jacques Ellul in France, a member of the Reformed Protestant Church. Dietrich Bonhoeffer in Germany, member of the Lutheran Church and later the Confessing Lutheran Church. And Leslie Newbegin from the United Kingdom, first a missionary to India, and then back in his mid-60s to England. That these three individuals, these three voices, interestingly enough, they were all born within 6 years of one another. Yes, Bonhoeffer died young, but all three of them in three different countries, Germany, France, and the UK, all born within 6 years of one another, all developed their theological vision for what it means to be the church in a secular age. They were doing this in the 1930s. That is, they were doing this almost a century ago. And I want to lean across this table and say to you, I cannot make this point strongly enough, that these voices, Newbegin, Bonhoeffer, and Ellul, are indispensable voices to the church in North America. They bring a weight and a nuance and a substance that it seems to me that they need to be part of our curriculum. I read Newbegin towards the end of my studies as a seminary student. There was still this kind of uncertainty that is even as an evangelical seminary, should we even be reading these kind of non-evangelical voices? So we were not allowed to read Barth until our last semester, and then very much, tentatively, because who knows, we might go off the deep end. And I didn't read Bonhoeffer until I'd left seminary and realized how powerful and influential his voice was and needs to be. I didn't read Jacques Ellul until after seminary. But these have been, for me, indispensable companions. And if you come to my personal library, you'll see a whole section on Ellul, on Bonhoeffer, and on Newbegin. And I commend maybe not all three of them to you, but at least as you think about what it means to navigate, what it means to be the church, what it means to be a scholar and teacher in a post-Christian secular age, that these are voices that are just indispensable companions to us. And that if not those three, at least recognize that as you're reading the Old Testament prophets, as you're reading, indeed, the early church, as you're reading at least some voices from the historic minority churches in the global South, that you're also tending to those voices from Western and Central Europe who are, in a sense, ahead of the curve, further down the trajectory from us, as we seek to navigate what it means to be the people of God in a post-Christian secular age. And what do we learn? What do we learn? Well, for one, I want to come back to a phrase that is found in Jeremiah's words to the people of Judah. You probably know where I'm going. In an extraordinary moment, about 2/3 of the way through his prophecy, he's writing to the people of Judah from Jerusalem. He's writing to the people of Judah, and he says to them, seek the peace of the city to which I have sent you. It is a simply staggering statement. Don't miss it. Babylon was their arch enemy. They would seek no good for this city. There is no possibility of seeking good for this city. And here is the prophet Jeremiah urging them to actually seek the peace of the city to which he is sending them, urging them to plant gardens, to build houses. He's urging them essentially to reside in that city, to make it their home. They're going to be citizens. Yes, like Augustine would put it, dual citizens. Citizens of Babylon, even if their true home is back in Jerusalem, and they'll go there. But for now, in this time and in this place, they're going to be citizens of this place. And it means, hear me on this, that their fundamental posture is not going to be adversarial. That is, they do not need to worship the gods of Babylon in order to seek the peace of the city of Babylon. That nuance is hugely important. But then within the space of 5 or 6 verses, Jeremiah not only says, seek the peace of the city, but then he adds this phrase. Twice he adds this phrase that just jolts me every time I see it. Seek the peace of the city to which I have sent you. Oh, could it be that in actual fact, this was providential for the people of Judah? That in actual fact, this was not some aberration, some historical aberration? That in actual fact, this was part of the purposes of God? This was part of his formative purpose, that indeed this was his will. It was providential. Which leads me then to ask a question that I would hardly dare ask Soren Kierkegaard, because I'm fearful with the force with which he would reply. But if I were to ask the question, could it be that the fact that we live now in a post-Christian secular age, could it be that this is providential? And if so, does it not fundamentally shape the way in which we choose to respond? Does it not fundamentally change the way or the disposition by which intellectually and emotionally we engage our time and our place? Does it not mean, on the one hand, that we cannot just go along to get along, even though we accept that we live in a secular age? Now we're going to ask the question, well, what does it mean to be the people of God in a secular age? What does it mean to seek the peace, in a sense, that God has sent us to? Could it be then that the option, dear people, of response cannot be one of retreat, that the Benedictine option is not an alternative that we can choose. That indeed, if we are called to be in but not of the society in which God has placed us, if we are called to be agents of God's redemptive presence by the gracious ministry of the Holy Spirit in this time and in this place, the option of retreat is simply cannot be an option for us. Now, I've been deeply shaped by the Ignatian spiritual and prayerful tradition. I'm a deep believer in the phenomena of retreat. I'm a deep believer in the practice of Sabbath rest and disengagement. So it's not that there isn't wisdom in the Benedictine model, but it cannot be our default mode, at least for those of us that take seriously the call to be a redemptive presence in the city to which we have been called. Thirdly, then, you understand that I cannot but furrow my brow at the culture wars response, at the response that is fundamentally adversarial, at the response that has the culture, my neighbors, Muslim and otherwise, thinking that the evangelical community is fundamentally adversarial to our times, to our culture. They're always in an embattled mode, it seems, that they're not, in a sense, bridge builders. They're not peacemakers. They're not seeking the peace. That indeed, it's a furrowed brow that I have, because this is part of the learning that we need to have, both from Jeremiah and the exilic prophets and post-exilic prophets, from the Daniels, from the Esthers, but also to look at the early church and say, so how did Ambrose of Milan navigate the political dynamics of the city of Milan? How did Jacques Ellul serve as deputy mayor in the city of Bordeaux? How did they navigate these waters? Can we learn from them and learn what it is that are the skills for navigating those waters? And then finally, the invitation from David Fitch, from James Davidson Hunter, to a faithful presence. I'm clearly, my proclivities, my inclination, my bias, I'm leaning that way, is indeed we are called to seek the peace of the city. And that means then that we learn how to be present in the city, and that indeed it's going to be a redemptive presence in the city. But that nuance of faithful presence is simply crucial. For going back to Jamie Smith, who I mentioned earlier, Jamie has made the observation that one of the dangers of being in but not of is that we would be in and of. That is, that we only can be a faithful presence, if we are a distinctive people of God. If we are other, we are in but not of. And one of the huge challenges of the church in our day is then to ask, what does it mean to be the church that is fully present to our society, but with a distinctive identity, with a distinctive orientation, with a distinctive set of sensibilities, convictions, beliefs, mores? And that means we're going to be asking the question, what does it mean to be the church? And here's where, in my estimation, those of us that would self-identify as evangelical, we're going to find that we're at a certain disadvantage. Douglas Farrow, originally Anglican, but now converted to Catholicism, professor at McGill University in Montreal, has made the observation that of all of the kind of theological formulations of the evangelical theological and spiritual tradition, that one of the gaps, you might say, along the way is that we have failed to develop a really powerful and nuanced ecclesiology. One of the underdeveloped areas, it may be the most pressing question of our day, is what it means to be the church. And while a generation ago, we could just take it for granted that a church is this, we've never done the theological homework to identify what it means to be the church. Now, more than ever, we need to ask, what does it mean to be the church? And we need to ask it not merely if we're going to be in pastoral ministry, not merely if we're doing a degree in pastoral ministry, but all of us are doing, in a sense, our scholarly work as those who are both, in my case, I'm both a churchman and an academic. That is, we are people who are located, more than likely every last one of you, have a deep sense of affiliation to the church. You can't do your scholarship except in connection with the church. And therefore you ask the question, well, then what does it mean to be the church? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What are its contours? Just as a side note here, I've invested quite a bit of energy on the ecumenical front as well. That is Roman Catholic and evangelicals in dialogue. And then starting last year, evangelicals and Orthodox, the Lausanne Orthodox Initiative that I was privileged to be part of at Holy Cross Theological Seminary in Boston. And with both my Catholic conversation partners and with my Orthodox conversation partners, people for whom I have developed a rich camaraderie and friendship and affection for them, they regularly tease me to say, so just what is an evangelical ecclesiology? And I assure them, my grandchildren are working on this. We will have it for you within the next generation or two. They call out, in a sense, our deficiencies. But here's one way to think about the church that at least could perhaps frame the conversation. That at least I find it helpful to think of the church as a threefold entity, or having three movements, you might say, three aspects or perspectives. The church is a worshiping community. The church is a teaching, learning community. The church is a community on mission. Or to reframe that, the church is a liturgical, catechetical, and missional community. By liturgical, I mean, going back here to Charles Taylor and Jamie Smith, as well as many other voices, that it's a community that sustains a sense of transcendence, a deep awareness in the face of secularity that there's more to life than what you can see, touch, taste, and feel. There's another dimension of reality. And we sustain this sense of transcendence against the backdrop of a culture and of people within that culture that you can never squelch transcendence. And indeed, the historic minority church in China has demonstrated powerfully that for all of the ways in which the atheistic regime, the Maoist regime, tried to squelch religion, you couldn't ultimately squelch the desire, the longing for the transcendent. And indeed, our worship needs to have a sense of the grandeur, the transcendence of our relationship as mere mortals to the one who sits on the throne of the universe. But secondly, to also realize this, that indeed the most formative thing that a church does is its liturgy as its worship. Still within my tribe, we have those who are responsible for leading worship on Sunday morning, and they're called the worship pastor. And we'll often in a larger church have those that are the pastor for discipleship and spiritual formation. And I chuckle a little bit at this because I wonder, do the worship leaders, have they been trained in discipleship and spiritual formation? Because nothing is more powerful. Nothing is more formative. Nothing so makes the people of God as what happens on Sunday morning. And if in effect, to use the language of Timothy Berger, if in effect Sunday morning infantilizes my language, juvenizes his language, juvenizes the people of God, that it's not formative, it's not cultivating the capacity for adult sensibilities, or if worship on Sunday morning is escapist, that is, it's kind of like the Disney-esque equivalent to what happens in the church. You kind of escape to a happy place. But if it does not actually equip and form us for what's happening Monday to Friday, that is, we need to ask hard questions of the liturgy. Is it cultivating transcendence? Is it cultivating spiritual maturity and growth? And thirdly, is it equipping and empowering for what it is we're called to do Monday through Friday? That is, we bring the pain, the ache of the world into our worship. And thus we bring lament into our worship. And we are equipped and empowered and encouraged for going back out on Monday morning. More on that in a moment. Secondly, to think of the church as a teaching, learning community or as a catechetical community. I just see an amen, and I've been leaning across this table looking for an amen. And finally, I get one. Thank you, whoever you are. Where was I? Can we recover a sense of those that are in pastoral leadership within the church, that these are fundamentally teachers, and that the church is a teaching, learning community? And without doubt, it will find diverse expressions. I repeat, it will find diverse expressions. I know full well that the old phenomena from when I was an intern pastor in the 1970s, there was an adult Sunday school class in the hour before the worship service, that's gone. I get it, that's gone. But what's gone is that now we have no equivalent. Where is it that the people of God are engaging in critical theological reflection on the ancient text and what it means to be the people of God today? Where, if you think about in this church and in this time and in this place, are these people wrestling with what it means to be Christian and doing so in a way that is deeply formed. It is alarming to me that the vast majority of the young people who come to this university, they come from evangelical churches, and their biblical literacy is staggering. Illiteracy, I should say, is staggering. They don't know their Bibles. That is, I wonder what they have been doing in their youth groups and in their churches. Part of this, I think, is that we need to recover, to go back to the early church. The early church conviction was that if indeed a person is going to become Christian, they cannot become Christian unless they are catechized. That is, Augustine initiated the great catechesis that then was renewed by the Roman Catholic Church in the rite for the Christian initiation of adults. Could it be that as evangelical Christians, we're a little bit late to the game, but we need to get with the program as well and realize that for the ancient church, you could not become a Christian unless you were catechized. That is, becoming a Christian was a catechetical process. Becoming a Christian was a teaching, learning process. You were not baptized until you had already moved into the rhythms of what it meant to be an integral member of a teaching, learning community. We will not form alternate communities. They equip people to be in, but not of the world. If and until we are teaching, learning communities, we make disciples through teaching. The early church devoted themselves to the teaching of the apostles. And then thirdly, what does it mean to be a missional community? I could lean into the witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer here. I could lean into the wisdom and insight of Jacques Ellul, without doubt. His book, Presence in the Modern World, is just, mine's a beat up copy. It's just an invaluable resource. But I'm going to lean here primarily into the wisdom of Lesslie Newbigin, who is, for many of us, the one who has changed the way that we speak about the church. Rather than speaking about the church as supporting missionary endeavors and initiative, to speak of the church as a missional community, that collectively, Newbigin's language, the church is the hermeneutic of the gospel. We embody what it is we are speaking about, and thus our capacity to live with resilient joy, our capacity to live with love for one another, even across political, ethnic lines, that indeed the idea that a church community would represent only one political, ethnic, white, suburban, Republican. What? I want to say, I just threw that in there. It seemed relevant today. That is to think that somehow we're a homogeneous community rather than a heterogeneous community. Part of the power of a heterogeneous community is precisely that we demonstrate that we love people that are different from us. And that's transformative. Lesslie Newbigin's line that indeed the church is a hermeneutic of the gospel. But then also, all three of those voices, going all the way back to Ambrose of Milan as well, would tell us that we need to learn what it means to be present in our world. And it involves, at the very least, three things, one of which I alluded to already. The one that I alluded to, and I'll build on now, is that what happens on Sunday morning is equipping and empowering the people of God for what happens on Monday morning. Whereas I like to say to preachers, preach not to attract, but for the dispersed people of God on Monday. That the inbreaking of the kingdom happens not Sunday morning when we gather, but Monday morning when the people of God are dispersed to the schools and the art galleries and the businesses of this city. That indeed the judge of whether or not you are effective in pastoral office is not because you've gathered a large crowd on Monday morning. You might be a charismatic, entertaining person, bless your heart. No, the real test of whether or not you're effective in ministry is whether God's people have been equipped to live and work and to be a presence of Christ Monday to Friday in the art galleries, in the schools, in the businesses to which they have been sent by God. Secondly, we need to I put a little aside about this earlier, but indeed, I made reference to political savvy or political nuance. When I was a seminary student back in the 1970s, as I mentioned, the word politics was a bad word. Pastors were not into being political. If you were political, something was amiss. But what we learn from Jacques Ellul, what we learn from the prophets, Daniel, Esther, what we learn also from Ambrose of Milan and Augustine is we better learn how to be political, because the only way to, in a sense, be the church in the world is to develop political capacity and nuance. And this includes, at the very least, three things. One, it includes understanding the idea of presence. That is, that one of the most powerful things we can do is to be present to our society and to realize we have no right to speak until we have been present and present long enough. I often think that I'm learning this as a grandfather, that some of the most significant things I do with my grandchildren is I'm just with them, and I mustn't underestimate that power. Secondly, political savvy, historic minority churches' voices would tell us is to learn the art of principled compromise. That phrase, principled compromise, is not an oxymoron. It is not an oxymoron. You can't be a purist in the public square. So you're always looking for who you can be bipartisan with. So much of what's going to happen in the next few months, in the United States of America, depends on the senator from Kentucky learning how to work with the new president who came from Delaware. Can these two work together for the well-being of the people of the United States of America? Can they put aside their political convictions and say, what's good to get? Can we be bipartisan? We used to be able to do that. In my lifetime, Teddy Kennedy and Jesse Helms actually brought policies to the Senate floor together. Amazing. Can we do it? Can we recover? Can the church demonstrate that we know how to work on the civic square in partnership with others that don't hold our same beliefs, but we can work to the common good, to learn what it means to live, to work towards legislation, policies, procedures that reflect principled compromise. And then finally, to know what it means to speak truth to power. Perhaps one of the most essential means, and no doubt Ambrose suffered because of it. He spoke truth to power. And indeed, the leaders of the church in Lebanon remind me that whenever we speak truth to power, we suffer for it because we're advocating for even our Muslim neighbors. We're advocating for the homeless. Right now, the church in Lebanon is advocating for refugees from Syria, and they're doing it in a way that makes the central government sometimes irritated and afraid and upset with them, but they'll do it. They said, we're going to speak truth to power. This is what we must do, and advocating for those who are less fortunate than we are. That's part of what it means to speak truth to power. And finally, when it comes to what it means to be the church on mission today, surely it involves the grace of learning the skill of peacemaking and reconciliation. I do actually wonder now. My seminary education included nothing at all on peacemaking, reconciliation, building peace. And I went as a pastor to a deeply conflicted church and was blindsided by this. I didn't even know how to navigate this one. What do I do now? Well, now for me, this is an indispensable skill that you've got to have this arrow in your quiver. And indeed, I long for the day in which there's deep turmoil in our cities and our mayors, our governors, our government officials look to the church to say, help us navigate these waters, help us navigate these deep divides. And the church, rather than fueling these deep divides, actually becomes an instrument of peace, whether it's happening in Northern Ireland, whether it's happening between Palestinian and Israelis, or whether it's happening in our own cities. Surely part of the call of the church is to seek the peace of the city to which we have been called and to be instruments of peace. Finally, this, in liturgy, in teaching, learning, and in mission, many have made the observation, and I only am going to echo it here, that it may well be that the most fundamental capacity of the church in our generation is hospitality. That is, that we know how to build bridges, how to welcome, how to be an instrument of God's grace with open arms, figuratively in these days, but literally, hopefully, sooner than later. That we know how to welcome the other at table. And indeed, to learn along the way from those voices along the way that show that radical hospitality is essential to what it means to be the church in a post-Christian secular society. Interestingly enough, my father understood this. When he was a missionary, my parents were missionaries in the jungles of Ecuador. They knew they needed to have a hospitable home. This is a place that you can come. But they also knew that hospitality meant going into their home and going in to eat what they wanted to feed them, that hospitality went both ways. And that indeed one of the most vital ways is to live not as enclaves, but building bridges to the communities in which we're a part, and hospitality is an essential way by which we do this. Can we do this? Can we be the church in a post-Christian secular and pluralist society? If so, may God grant us wisdom for this time. May God grant us the insight and capacity to be all that we are called to be today. May God grant us courage to be what we are called to be. And that courage will mean, going back to Rowan Williams, Williams suggested that the greatest threat to the church in a post-Christian secular society is not external to us, but internal to us. I repeat, that the greatest threat to the church in a post-Christian secular society is not external to us. It's not secularity. It's not Islam. It's not refugees from south of the border for you, from other places for us. That is, the greatest threat to the church is internal to us, not external to us. And he says the greatest threat to the church is fear. And I'm struck by this in reading him, because the book that I read immediately before I read that, In the Truths of God by Rowan Williams, was a book by Henry Nouwen, in which he describes the fact that we live in a culture of fear. And I've been reading the poem by W.H. Auden, The Age of Anxiety, published in the late 40s in the UK, interestingly enough. But Auden was convinced, and poets are prophets, are they not? Auden was convinced that post the Second War, European society was now living in the age of anxiety, what Nouwen calls the culture of fear. And that indeed, therefore, we will only be able to navigate these waters, my sisters and brothers, if we are part of communities that cultivate not fear and anxiety and fretfulness, but the capacity to live with, to use the immortal words of the Apostle Paul, the peace that transcends all understanding. Oh God, grant us that grace. I serve as the president of a relatively small university, as universities go, which means that for every faculty appointment, it crosses my desk, and I interview them at some point in the process. And I don't know, whether this person's qualified to teach biochemistry. My goodness, I don't know. And in our business program, whether this person is qualified to teach marketing and communication, I have some ideas about this, but I don't know. And whether this person's qualified to teach Shakespeare in our English program, I can assure you, I don't know. They look smart. It seems like they went to a distinguished university, so I assume they can. No, when I'm interviewing them, and the provost is in the room with me, we're interviewing them, and we're going through the necessary steps to ask the question, will this person own our mission? Will this person understand what it means to be this university, our distinctive mission and ethos? Will they get it? But there's something else. I want the interview to go long enough that this question can be in the backdrop, and it's this question. Will this person lower the anxiety level around here, or will they raise it? Will this person lower the anxiety level or raise it? For you see, the young people who come here, the undergraduates, high school graduates, or in their late teens, early 20s, they come to university with an almost pathological level of fear. I know that as an undergraduate in the 70s, we worried about stuff, but not like this. Fear now is just a given. It's just the air that we breathe. And therefore, our university, our seminary, our churches, our communities of learning need to be spaces and places where we're growing in the grace of the peace that transcends all understanding. That individually, we know what it means for fear to be diminished. And Nouwen suggests that fear will never entirely go away, but he says you can learn to send it over to the corner and beat on it with a stick if it starts to come out into the middle of the room. You'll recognize it when it's coming. You'll recognize when you've chosen to speak or act out of fear. And you will turn and say, no, I will speak and I will act with the deep confidence that Christ sits on the throne of the universe, that all is well and will be well. And for this time and in this place, so help us God, we will have the wisdom and the courage to be all that we are called to be in this post-Christian secular society.